is perhaps the toughest sanction the West has levied against Russia. Around 70% of its banks and financial institutions have been cut off from SWIFT, the system used by banks to send money across borders. It is a move that's impact reaches well beyond Russia itself. Many banks in the US, the EU and the UK have given loans to Russian firms who can now no longer service them. It's unclear exactly how much banks have loaned to Russian companies, but the experts are putting this number somewhere in the tens of billions of euros. Then there is, of course, the potential for sovereign debt default. Russia's central bank can't access its assets abroad and is on course to miss repayments to its creditors. Now, Russia currently owes nearly $50 billion to lenders in the West. Payments are due within the next 2 weeks, one for $100 million in interest, another of over $2 billion. Among the countries levying sanctions on Russia is Switzerland. It's an unprecedented step for the financial hub that prides itself on staying neutral, but it's still being urged to take further action.
Zurich is one of the world's most expensive places, and that's in no small part due to Russian oligarchs happy to invest their money here. Rudolf Elmer used to be a top banker at the venerable Zurich bank Julius Baer. Today, he is a critic of these financial institutions, who came to international prominence as a WikiLeaks whistleblower. A lot of money is invested in Switzerland because banking secrecy protects the oligarchs. We have a strict secrecy law. The government, politicians and the judiciary support this because it is a huge source of income for the Swiss state. Russia's brutal war against Ukraine has put worldwide pressure on Switzerland to respond. It's likely one of the reasons why the government here has backed the sanctions, saying Russian oligarchs should no longer be able to access their assets here. But Elmer is skeptical. Switzerland was slow to introduce sanctions, and that gave the oligarchs plenty of time to shift their fortunes somewhere else. Concealing the origin of money is a long tradition in Switzerland. This means that the actual owner is disguised via trusts in the Cayman Islands or companies or whatever in such a way that you don't really know who is behind it. The Swiss Bankers Association rejects this accusation, saying the sanctions would be strictly observed. It's important to understand that these sanctions oblige banks to report Russian customers to the authorities. Banking secrecy is never absolute. It can be affected by a legal obligation to provide information. And that is also the case with these sanctions. Russia's Gazprom Bank and Sberbank, seen here in Zurich, are exempt from the sanctions. That allows EU countries like Germany to still be able to buy Russian oil and gas through them. But public criticism is growing. Sberbank in Zurich has covered over its logo and lowered window blinds for fear of protests. The Swiss NGO Public Eye has long criticized the Russian banks, and now it says they're playing a critical role in Moscow's war. This is, of course, a substantial part of Vladimir Putin's war chest. He calculated it that way from the start, and also anticipated that this money, at least, would continue to flow. We're talking about $1 billion a day, 80% of which comes from Swiss commodities trading platforms. One of the data centers for the SWIFT bank payment system is very close to Zurich. It's currently under heavy guard for fear of Russian sabotage. But Elmer doesn't think a complete Russian cutoff from SWIFT would be that dramatic for Russia. There are various ways of getting around this, like intercompany deals, banks holding bank accounts at other banks, and trade shortcuts, as well as barter transactions. There are many variants, and you have to see that this payment transaction business has become even more lucrative today due to the sanctions. Rudolf Elmer now lives in seclusion near Zurich, but he hasn't stopped criticizing Switzerland's financial institutions and authorities. He's demanding strict laws for better monitoring of the financial centre, but so far says he's seen no willingness in the government to take action.
Well, I've been speaking to Jörg Rockol, who's president of the European School of Management and Technology, ESMT Berlin. I asked him how surprising it was that Switzerland had joined the EU in sanctioning Russia.
The fact that Switzerland joined is certainly just representing the overall observation that we have at this point of time, that there is such a strong unified approach across Western countries that no one could escape. And in particular, we've seen in the past that any bank that tries to escape or, say, circumvent sanctions has been penalized heavily by, in particular, US authorities. So therefore, it might be a little bit surprising, but in light of the overall developments and also in light of what we've seen as penalties in the past, it's maybe not that surprising.
Is it a big blow to the Russian banking system to have these sanctions from Switzerland in particular, given the role that it plays with its much stricter secrecy laws?
This is certainly a blow to Russian banks, but maybe it's even more a blow in the asset management part. So this means if wealthy Russians put their money to Switzerland, now they are sanctioned as well. Swiss banks are extremely careful in now operating on a level actually with any Russian client, and thus it becomes also more difficult to withdraw private money from Switzerland and use it for other purposes.
Is this the sort of change that could last for a long time? What's the feeling with these sanctions, that they're going to be in place forever and Russians are permanently going to have to find a new way to move their money around and indeed move their exports?
I see two elements here. For sure, I would expect the sanctions to be in place for the foreseeable future. But there's another aspect, and maybe this aspect might become even more important so in the long run, which is the voting by feet mechanism that we see now. We've seen that many Western companies, even companies that were not restricted to do so by the sanctions, that they have actually started withdrawing their business from Russia, that also Western companies don't want to work anymore with say, Russian subsidiaries in Europe, in the United States. And this voting by feet has taken really a very massive, a very strong movement over the last 2 weeks. And this is something that, in my view, has not seen the end yet, but rather will continue. And then it will be very hard to revert these decisions, in particular, as we see now, if the Russian government even wants to nationalize, to expropriate the assets that Western companies have left in Russia.
Yeah, it's a major change for Russia that keeps getting worse. It keeps getting more and more isolated from the rest of the world. And indeed, it's looking less and less likely that Russia's going to be able to pay its debts to its foreign creditors. Default looks almost certain, doesn't it?
Yes, indeed. The rating agencies have now made very clear statements that Russian sovereign debt just is at a junk status. It's also not clear anymore whether, even if Russia did have the money, whether they would be even willing to pay, so that they basically voluntarily declare default. This is why basically even more of the linkages of the international financial systems to Russia will be stopped. And it will even isolate Russia more in many different ways. And the financial system is certainly at the forefront of this first wave of sanctions.